How do we classify the millions of living things that exist on this planet? Well, we certainly want to classify them into groups. Otherwise, biology is a tedious process. I mean, why would one study one organism or its anatomy or its genetics if then you had to then start studying millions more? And so therefore, we do break life into groups. Now, this is a long playlist and it could be much, much longer. But what I simply want to review is just the system of grouping. And so thus then each of these topics could be considered then individually later. So rather than focus on how, say, primates are classified or plants are classified, that can be a discussion for later. The reason to do this is, as a biology instructor, I certainly know how hard it is to study even one organism. So for example, students in human anatomy and physiology, they spend 2 semesters just studying one organism and then very often spend the rest of their lives specializing in it. That's just one. And so why would you even begin studying biology if what you learned about one organism couldn't be applied to others? There would just be this incredible list of facts you'd have to memorize, which would not have any connection to any other ones. Biology would just be a horrible practice unless we could put things into groups. All right, and so in my classes, at a certain point, it becomes very useful to say that's a primate. Because once you know it's a primate, there are things that are true of primates, forward-facing eyes, more dexterous hands, a post-orbital bar. And then you say, oh, now that I know that that organism is a primate, I know things about it because I already have studied other primates. So what I've learned about one primate can now help me understand others. What I understand about one mammal helps me understand, things about other mammals, one vertebrate, one insect, etc. And so if we could classify life's diversity into groups, that just makes our life so much easier. And biology now makes sense. So that's our goal. Now, in doing so, it would be easy to classify things in groups. So for example, I could look at these organisms and say, okay, so 2 are yellow. Let me make a yellow group. I think 2 are ugly. I'll make an ugly group, etc. So it's easy to split things into groups. However, these are horrible groups. And the reason that there are horrible groups is that they don't help us understand life's diversity. We can't make predictions from it. So now that we've put these 2 in the yellow group, what would we predict that they share? And the answer is nothing. This yellow flower and this yellow frog, they don't have anything really much in common other than them being yellow. What does the spider and the turkey vulture have in common? Or this amphibian and this snake? So there aren't features that really unite this group. This doesn't really make us to allow us to make valid predictions about other organisms which we haven't studied yet. So it turns out that there are good groups and bad groups. So how do biologists classify life? What kind of groups do we come up with? Well, the key here is what is called a nested hierarchy. And I'll spend the rest of this video trying to defend or trying to explain this. So as you looked at those same organisms, biologists would come up with a group called, say, birds. Now, birds, we could attach a label to that later. We could call that a class, but we'll get to that. And once you know that these are birds and you study one bird, you can then actually make very accurate predictions about the bones, the heart, the respiratory system, the muscular system, the brain of one bird based on your understanding of another bird. All right, and so that seems to be a real biological group. There are traits which unite them, and knowing something about one lets you make predictions which turn out to be true about another group. Well, these birds and this snake are what we refer to as amniotes. And it turns out that they share a feature that the non-amniotes don't have. All right, and so just like there are traits which unite the birds, which non-birds don't have, there are traits that unite the amniotes, skeletal traits, muscular traits, features of the egg, like the amnion, for which the group is named. And so that is a group. Now notice that these aren't mutually exclusive. Birds form a group within the amniotes, so birds are a subgroup of amniotes. Then if we include these are vertebrates. And so vertebrates is a larger group. There are traits which unite the vertebrates. Within the vertebrates, there is a subgroup known as amniotes. Within the amniotes, there is a subgroup of birds. Vertebrates are share features with this spider because they form a larger group known as animals. Then there's an even larger group called eukaryotes. But the point is that not only do there seem to be real biological groups, not silly groups like the yellow or ugly group, which don't really allow us to understand life any better. Knowing that something is an amniote, if I were to tell you that this animal over here is an amniote, if you knew your amniotes, you could say, oh, I already now know a lot about its bones, its muscles, its nerves, its genes, its, a whole list of traits, because there are things that amniotes share. Knowing that something is in this group allows you to make predictions which turn out to be true. Biology now becomes understandable, as opposed to this meaningless mass of facts. That's very useful. But now notice it is what's called a nested hierarchy of groups within groups. So these aren't mutually exclusive groups which seem to be unconnected. Instead, they all seem to be connected, but to varying degrees. Just as you are related to all other people on planet Earth, but not all people equally. So your siblings are more closely related to you than your cousins are a little more closely. So if we were to look at your relationship to other people, it would be a nested hierarchy. You're related to everybody, but to some people more than others. And in the same way, when we look at these living things, they are all related to each other. There are characteristics that all living things share. But then within the group of living things, there are groups and subgroups showing that living things are related to each other to varying degrees. Now, I'd like to just go through some of the groupings. Once again, the purpose of this is to just kind of talk about groupings in general, and not to focus on dogs, on bears. That's what the videos do, and you can play them later if you'd like. But instead, just to kind of follow this grouping. So let's look at, say, domestic dogs. Domestic dogs haven't always existed. So there have not always been domestic dogs. In fact, if you were to look at all of history, domestic dogs are rather recent. And so this is a new group. And the reason it is a new group, and we know this because we humans, we domesticated the dogs, was that wolves were then domesticated and bred for certain traits to create all of these breeds. And so when we look at the different groups of domestic dog, they form a group, all right, which we call a subspecies of the Canis lupus species. And so dogs are more closely related to each other than they are to wolves. And so if we were to then look at the group Canis lupus, which is a species, the reason that we say this is because the scientific terminology for naming things includes a first word, which is the genus, the next group we look at. And so there you see the capital letter, the genus name is always capitalized. And then the second name, lupus, that is the species name. So genus, species. The Canis lupus species also is relatively new. Although if we look for fossils of Canis lupus, they actually predate those of domestic dogs. Now, there haven't always been wolves of the species. There were once earlier wolves, all right? But if you go back, say 100,000 years ago. Some of these earlier wolves gave rise to Canis lupus. So within the past, 100,000 years, there have been wolves of the species Canis lupus. And if we were to now look at these dogs and put them into groups, well, it would turn out that we could, whether it be through genetic traits or anatomical traits, put these three in the Canis lupus species. Not these are dogs, and they're related and they share features. But if we were going to name a group, the species group, the Canis lupus species, then this is Canis lupus. And from Canis lupus, then the domestic dog was derived. Now, obviously, and we can get into this, there can be, especially with dogs, there can be some hybridizations, where a dog breeder says, let me try to reintroduce a little bit of wolf. But let's just talk about the big picture for right now. So in this family tree, this point here represents the common ancestor of both wolves and dogs, and it occurred at this point in history. The common ancestor of domestic dogs is more recent. And so as we put these groups together, not only do we notice a nested hierarchy where there are groups within groups, but also we see that this reflects their history. So the smaller groups have a common ancestor which was more recent. The larger groups have a common ancestor which occurred further back in time. And so there is a species, the wolf species of Canis lupus, the gray wolf, and from Canis lupus was derived a subspecies of domestic dog, Canis lupus domesticus. But then, in addition to Canis lupus, there are other dogs which have the first name Canis, like coyotes, for example, Canis latrans. And so therefore, as we compare this group to all other groups, it turns out that wolves are more closely related to coyotes than they are to, say, African wild dogs or foxes, as we will see. And Canis, and so therefore we put these together in the same genus Canis. That's a larger group. So the genus is a larger group, Canis, and within it is the species Canis lupus, and then the species of coyote, which is Canis latrans. African wild dogs, some people have classified it in Canis, some people just outside of Canis. So that's why I have put it there. And so here we are. There's a slightly larger group, the genus. And I'm not going to, go through all of the features about dogs, because then I want to mention, bears and cats. And the point is not dogs, bears, or cats, but instead the process of grouping these together. And so when we look at genus Canis, is it equally related to all other dogs and all other organisms? Well, the answer is no. And so therefore, then we can create a larger group which includes not only the genus Canis, but its closest relatives. All right, so this would include then red foxes. Oops, there we go. And so once again, we could, extend this family tree to create more and more groups. So there's a subspecies, there's a species, then there's a genus, which puts together a related species. And then I'm going to use the basic names like genus, species, etc. But then we could come up with other names like the tribe. So the tribe Canine would then include some dogs, including the South American ground dog. We could then extend this further to make what's called a subfamily. All right, and so inside a group of organisms, we can split them into families and subfamilies. Let me just jump to. So as we group these organisms together, it's based on features. Now, once again, I don't want to focus here on dogs, but we could list them. So you could say, if there's a dog family, what are the features which make a dog a dog? And so we have families and then subfamilies. And once again, in this basic, we're not going to focus on that, but say the family Canidae, that's the dog family. And then there are subfamilies in here, but then we would have to start talking about fossil dogs as well. So the point then is dogs are a biological group. There are traits that they share, all right? And so learning the anatomy of one dog then allows you to make predictions about other dogs. So compared to bears, all right, there are features like in the teeth and the snout, which dogs have. You could then make predictions. But then, for example, in this group of dogs, not all dogs are equally related. Some are more closely related to others, gray foxes being the most distantly related to others. And so the dog family is a system of groups within groups. So we have a dog family, they're all related. And then we have a subfamily, which would then exclude some fossil members. And then within the subfamily, we see a branching family tree. So when we look at the teeth of gray foxes, for example, they are less like the teeth of the others. Gray foxes can include more plant material in their diet. And so if we were then to draw a family tree, all of these would be in the family Canidae. If we exclude fossil members, they would all be in a subfamily. But if you notice the family tree, gray foxes would have shared the last common ancestor with dogs farther back in time. So this is the branch which is least closely related to the others. Red foxes are more closely related to dogs than gray foxes are. Coyotes are more closely related to dogs than red foxes are. Wolves are more closely related to dogs than coyotes are. And so this is how biologists classify life, in a nested hierarchy of groups. So there are groups within groups. So all of those dogs were related, but they weren't related to equal degrees. Now, that was not just true of dogs. And because I want to focus on the grouping, you can pursue this, now if you like, or, if you're studying this later in the semester, you may. And so we could do the same with bears. Not all bears are equally related. So for example, there are subspecies of brown bear. So Ursus arctos horribilis, and I think actually I messed that up, I'm sorry. So that's the grizzly bear, and then Ursus arctos alaskensis, that's the Alaskan brown bear, I'm sorry, I reversed those. And so there are two subspecies of the species Ursus arctos. But then the polar bears, that's a species which is more closely related to the brown bear, having evolved from brown bears, than say black bears are. So once again, when we look at bears, we see not only do we put them into a real biological groups because they share anatomical features, they share genetic features. They also then can be classified in a nested hierarchy of groups within groups, with some bears, like polar bears and brown bears, being more closely related than either are to black bears. Then polar bears, black bears, and brown bears would form a group which would be more closely related to each other than the short-faced bears. And so as we look at bears throughout history, that we could see how from common ancestors, maybe these lineages split, and that from a later time, more lineages evolved within that group. And so not only are there species of bears, we can put related species into a genus, and then we could put related genera into subfamilies and families. All bears belong to the family Ursidae, but it turns out then there are different subfamilies of the bear family Ursidae. And so, these are all members of the same subfamily, but the short-faced bears, these belong to a different subfamily of bears. Panda bears belong to still another subfamily. And so once again, we have a bear family that can be broken into different subfamilies. That can be broken into different genera. See Arctodus, that's a genera. Ursus, that's a genera. A genus. And so there are, this is a different subfamily. And then the panda bears would be the most distantly related subfamily. And so here we see that bears form a group, a family, all right? And they are all related. They share genetic and anatomical features, but they are not all related to the same degree. And so we form different subfamilies. These species are more closely related to each other. These species are more closely related to each other. And on this family tree, these branch points mention that further back in history, the panda bear branch broke off, so pandas are less related to these other two. And then the short-faced bear branch broke off, forming that subfamily. And then all of these bears are more closely related to each other than any are to this. And so these branch points indicate when the common ancestors diverged from others. Okay. Now, there are a million species on Earth, and we can obviously now go through each and every one, but that's not the point of this video, which is just to focus on the grouping. So in the same way, if we were to look at cats, there are species of cats. The species which are most closely related to each other, we put together in the same genus, all right? So there's a genus Felis, all right, which includes all of the cats which are most closely related. So we have the genus Felis, which puts related species together. And then we can put related genera together in subfamilies and families. So it turns out there is a subfamily Felinae, all right, which has the relatives of domestic cats, all right? And so things like cheetahs, pumas, and lynx would actually be in the subfamily Felinae. They are more closely related to domestic cats than they would say to be lions and tigers. Lions and tigers, they are in a different subfamily, Pantherinae. And in the fossil record, there were other subfamilies, such as the subfamily of the saber-toothed cats. And so there is a family Felidae, that's a group. So cats share features that separate them from, say, dogs and bears. But within the cat family, then we have subfamilies. So there's a panther subfamily, a Felis cat subfamily. There were the saber-toothed cats. That was a separate subfamily. And so there are groups within groups. All cats are related to each other, but to varying degrees. So here's obviously then the saber-toothed cat. That is a separate subfamily of cats. So here now we have three families. There's a dog family, there's a bear family, and there's a cat family. But then these are all carnivores, and as such, they are more closely related to each other than they are to other mammals, such as primates or rodents or artiodactyls like cows, etc. And that's because if we go to further back in history, there were ancestors of all carnivores. So order Carnivora, that's a group which shares features. And then we could split the order Carnivora into a dog half, a suborder, Caniformia, and a cat half, Feliformia. There are traits, anatomical traits, which cause this. Like, so for example, how the middle ear is enclosed. There are genetic traits which cause this. So once again, here we have a groups, but the order now is a bigger group. The order contains related families. So cats, dogs, and bears, these are families of carnivores. And so the order Carnivora is a bigger group which contains related families. And once again, if we wanted to, we could split this into suborders, infraorders, superfamilies, etc. And so that's the next biggest group. Now, as I start to wrap this up, I wanted to focus, say, on carnivores, cats, dogs, and bears, because I think they're more familiar with it to us. But we could have done this with any group. So if we wanted to look at frogs, all right, so there are groups of frogs, which we call suborders, all right? So there's the order Caudata, okay, and the order Anura. Right. Cool. So if you wanted to follow amphibian lineages, we could break amphibians into a group. Amphibians would form a big group, which we call a class. That's the next group, which we're getting to. But then we could split these classes then into orders. All right. And so if we were to focus, say, on frogs, that's the order Anura. We could then break that into suborders. We could then break that into families. So bullfrogs are in a family that's different from the tree frogs. And so exactly the same types of grouping we could apply then to frogs. So there are species of frogs. Related species are put into a genus. Related genera are put together in a family. All right. Related families are put together in an order. Now, once again, we could have suborders and infraorders and subfamilies, and so we can have other lineages here as well. And that would, the order for frogs would then separate them from the order, say, of salamanders. They would be in the same class. All right, so amphibians would be considered a class. That's a bigger group that now has different orders. We could do the same with birds. All right, so there's a bird order Picaformes, which includes woodpeckers, toucans, and related families. So toucans would be in a family, woodpeckers would be in a family, and the related families then belong to an order. And that would, say, be different from the order which includes the parrots. All right, and so then parrots form an order, and we could then break the order of parrots into families and subfamilies, and then a lot of these orders of birds could then be together, put together in a class for birds, the class Aves. So just like there was a class Amphibia, which includes orders for frogs and salamanders, there's an order for birds that would include parrots and woodpeckers. And so, we could go through all of life's diversity, and, we could. There's an order primates, which we belong to. And so if we were to look at all of these other mammals, like opossums or this cat, all right, they are not in the order primates. The order primate would include the lemur, some monkeys, the apes, and then we humans. We put them together in an order because of the traits that they share. All right, so there are anatomical traits, there are genetic traits, which all primates share, which is why we classify them in this order primates. Now, the carnivores are mammals, primates are mammals, and so these different orders would then go into a class. And so the class Mammalia, they have they share features that the birds and the amphibians don't. So mammals share hair and mammary glands and an enlarged cerebral cortex, and we could go on and on. So there are lots of traits which would then unite the class Mammalia, which would separate them from the class Aves with the birds, which share a lot of features to the class amphibians, etc. But then we could put the bird, the mammals, and then heck, even, you know, some fish, etc., into a larger group. There's a subphylum of vertebrates. There's a phylum of chordates. And so we could come up with a big group, the phylum, all right? And so we, humans, we are in the phylum Chordata. And that's different from being then in the phylum Mollusca, like a clam, or the phylum Arthropoda, like an insect. And then obviously there can be more groups. So we can talk about animals and, you know, even then the larger kingdoms, you know, the kingdom of animals, the kingdom of plants, etc. And so the point is, bringing all of this together, is that biologists need a way to make sense of this, you know, biological world. And so we create this nested hierarchy. All life is related, but to varying degrees. So once again, if you were to, you know, look at how closely related you are to other people on the planet, there's you, there's your siblings, you know, in a slightly larger group. A slightly larger group includes you and your cousins, a slightly larger group, your second cousins, then people you don't recognize at your wedding, you know, et cetera. And so you are related to all individuals, but to varying degrees. And then if we were to then apply the same reasoning to the life on Earth, we see groups. All life is related, but then within the group of living things, there is a subgroup called eukaryotes, and a subgroup of eukaryotes, which we call animals, and a subgroup of animals, which we call the chordates, and a subgroup of chordates, which we call the vertebrates, et cetera, or the jawed vertebrates within that group, or the amniotes, or the mammals, et cetera. And so biologists classify life into this nested hierarchy of groups within groups. Now, very often, you know, we ask introductory students to memorize the big ones. So there's, you know, a kingdom. So we are in the kingdom Animalia, for example. And then within the kingdom, there's a phylum. We are in the phylum Chordata with the chordates. And then within the phylum, there is a class. We are in the class Mammalia because we have hair, and many other mammalian features. Within the class, there are orders. We are in the order primates. Within the order, there is a family. Within the family, there are related genera. Within the genus, there are related species. And then each of these could be then subdivided. So there can be suborders, infraorders, superfamilies, etc. Now, this is perhaps beyond, you know, us to, you know, a significant degree, so not to focus on this, but then we can test that, because there are discussions on, you know, is this group of worms more closely related to arthropods or more closely related to mollusks? Like, who belongs in the group? And sometimes the anatomical studies, you know, point to a slightly different pattern of grouping than the genetic studies do, or a new paper is published that says, you know, we haven't really figured out this group of invertebrates, and I think they belong over here. And so there are ways of, you know, trying to analyze this. So for example, you could say, well, if it's a real group, there should be features that only this group has. All right, so there should be features that only the primates have that define primates. We could call them derived features or synapomorphies. So there, you know, if insects are a group, then there should be shared features that only the insects have, etc. And so then we could, you know, analyze the groups which you know, we have created, you know, in a more scientific sense, objective sense, so that, you know, here you've proposed this grouping of living things, but is it valid? You know, does the evidence support that? And so, like all scientific ideas, you know, feel free to make a hypothesis. I feel that these things should be grouped together. But we could then test that. You know, does the evidence we get from comparing the genes, the anatomical structures, et cetera, support this? And so this has just been an overview of how biologists classify the great diversity of life on Earth into this nested hierarchy of groups. So that, for example, we have big groups like the kingdom, then within that the phylum, then within that the class, the order, the family, the genus, the species. And hopefully this then serves as a foundation for you then to apply this in all of the following groups, whether they be bacteria or plants, or animals, etc.